The phone call between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky has Americans talking, and we're going to talk about that today. I'm Tom Vandervoort from the University of Virginia's Miller Center, and I think our temptation may be to talk about this phone call through the lens of domestic politics. But I think maybe what we ought to do is start with foreign policy. And for that, I'm going to turn to my good friend Eric Edelman, longtime diplomat for our nation, twice an ambassador. And I'm looking to you for your reaction to what's going on here. And the first question I really have is, explain to me the position of Ukraine in a national security sense for the United States. What is the importance of the Ukraine to the security of Europe and to our own national security?
Well, Tom, it's great to be with you, and it's good to be talking about this subject in the way that you framed it, because I think all too often this is now just being seen totally through the lens of whether or not the president will be impeached and the domestic political consequences of that for the 2020 election. But Ukraine remains a very, very important country in its own right, and the U.S. relationship with Ukraine is important. It's important because when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991-92, one of the key elements of the breakup was the decision of Ukrainian leaders to become independent. And Ukraine has got a very geostrategically important location. It had traditionally been the sort of breadbasket of Russia. It was also a place where a lot of Russian industry, including defense industry, Soviet defense industry, had been located. And so it is a very, very important location geopolitically. The sad thing, as Jackson Deal of the Washington Post wrote this morning in a very good column in the Washington Post, the sad thing is Ukraine policy has largely been sort of unaffected by the twists and turns of American domestic politics for the last 20 years. Through the Bush 41, Clinton, Bush 43, Obama administrations, there had been enormous continuity in American foreign policy towards Ukraine. Enormous frustration, because Ukraine is I must say, having worked on these issues myself in the early 90s, and then again in the first term of George W. Bush 43, it's a frustrating place to do business. It's been beset by a very corrupt political class throughout its independent history. But it has been a place where policy has been largely untouched by domestic politics. And I hope that remains the case after this is all over, but I worry that it might not be.
And so is our policy towards them, that you talk about the continuity there, is that basically support for Ukrainian independence in the face of Russian aggression? Is that a fair statement?
It's been support for an independent Ukraine, a Ukraine that is able to support itself and also can create a political order that is not beset by corruption, and is a party to and part of the main institutions of Europe's economic future and its security future. Now, that has been in the past, the EU and its relationship with NATO, whether that was membership or some other form of relationship with NATO. That's been a matter of some debate, but it's basically been to maintain Ukraine's Western orientation and to preserve its independence, as you suggested.
So with respect to these anti-tank weapons that the Ukrainian president was asking about, why was he asking about those in particular? Is that a key thing for them, or was that just like, oh, I'd like to know where these things are? Or how do you read that particular point in the phone call?
Well, so since 2014, you have to go back to the outbreak of the war in eastern Ukraine that was created essentially by Russian aggression. First, the Russians infiltrated Russian soldiers, not dressed in actual uniforms, but the so-called little green men who showed up wearing non-standard uniforms, who slowly took over Crimea and ultimately detached it from Ukraine in a referendum, which I think most observers believe was fraudulent, although there is a certain amount of support for attachment to Russia in Crimea. But it ended up with Crimea becoming a part of Russia once again, and the destabilization of eastern Ukraine, the so-called Donbass, the Don River Basin region. And that area has been engaged in a low-level conflict between separatist forces with very direct support from the Russian military and the Ukrainian central government since 2014. And so the Javelin request has to be seen in that context. It was a request for lethal military assistance, which would allow the Ukrainians to be able to defend themselves against Russian armor, that is to say, Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers, etc.
Which is reminiscent of our Cold War posture when I think, the idea of Russian tanks, rolling west was definitely in the forefront of our minds. At least when I was in the military, that was something that I really remember being talked about.
Yeah, this is not, this is a little bit more of an unconventional war, really, in eastern Ukraine right now. It's not a main force-on-force engagement, but there are enough regular Russian forces that obviously the Ukrainians want to be able to deter further Russian aggression, and Javelin would have been part of that effort at deterrence.
And it occurs to me when you talk about unrest and separatist forces within Ukraine, it is reminiscent, at least in my mind, as a student of history, of Sudeten Czechs and ethnic Germans in Poland. And is there a similar rationale here? We need to go in because we have minorities that aren't being protected, that kind of thing?
Well, there's absolutely a similar rationale. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there were some 25,000 Russians who were left stranded outside the new borders of the Russian Federation, and in what were now, newly independent countries that were made up out of the old republics, constituent republics of the Soviet Union. Some of them have actually, in fairness, met with some degree of discrimination or other issues that they've had to deal with as a result of being Russian in a former multinational empire. And that is something that Putin has played on inside Russia in terms of Russian domestic politics, appointing himself and posing as the great protector of the Rossiyani, the Russian speakers.
I see. So now getting back to the phone call and the weapons themselves, I'm to understand that President Trump, that the weapons had been allocated in a sense for delivery to Ukraine, but President Trump has withheld those. I think people wonder, is that kind of a normal thing? Is that just something the president does to get policy, to get the country, to have leverage against the country, to get them to do what they want? And then, of course, it's all speculation about what they might be. But I'm trying to get at how usual is it for the president to take this action?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to make clear at the outset that I don't believe Javelin was a part of the package that was at issue.
I see.
This was a different package of military assistance that the Congress had approved and authorized for transfer to Ukraine. There's a bit of confusion here, and I don't think we know all the facts yet. But here are the facts, I think, that we do know, which is there was broad support inside the U.S. government for the transfer of these weapons, of this military package of assistance. There was a military package, and there was some other assistance as well to Ukraine. On the issue that some of the president's defenders have raised, and which the president invoked in the call, in the memorandum of conversation that we have that was released by the White House, was the issue of corruption in Ukraine. But in May, well before this call had taken place, my successor, several times removed as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, John Rood, had certified to the committees of oversight of the Congress, the Armed Services Committees, that Ukraine had taken all the necessary steps required in the law to be certified for taking steps to improve the situation of corruption. And his letter lists about 7 or 8 different independent steps that Ukraine had taken. So there didn't appear to be any issue with regard to that. The press has reported that officials at State, Defense, and the National Security Council, all of whom supported this, were not aware of the reasons for the suspension or holdup of the assistance. And we know from press reporting that congressional staffers who inquired about this to OMB were told that there was an interagency review going on about Ukraine, although we now know that's not the case. On the face of it, it lacked surface plausibility because the press has been reporting that under the tenure of former National Security Advisor John Bolton, that there had not really been an interagency process ongoing for anything, much less Ukraine. So this was clearly a pretext. Now, who ordered the suspension? What the reason for that order is, we still don't know. Presumably, we will find out at some point as this impeachment investigation goes forward.
So that is an important question for Americans to ask, would you say? Americans should be interested in what the reasoning was from a policy standpoint or from whatever standpoint that the package wasn't delivered and that perhaps that he was asking about these javelins and who knows how they're related. But Americans may want to know that just to understand policy in the region.
Yeah, I think we need to know the facts about why the assistance that had been approved by the Congress, in which the Ukrainians were undoubtedly expecting to arrive at any moment and must have noticed that it wasn't arriving, what the reason for that was. Part of the defense that the president and his allies have offered is that he was either trying to ascertain something about corruption in Ukraine, although, as I've said, that would seem to have been laid to rest by the certification from DOD to the committees. He's also raised another issue, which is the idea that our allies were not doing anything to support Ukraine, although there are two problems with that, which is the EU has actually provided several times more assistance to Ukraine since 2014 in the last 5 years, and we have something on the order of $16 billion worth of assistance. Nor is it apparent that there was any ask of the Europeans in connection with the suspension of this aid. So I think that's more a pretext than it is an actual reason, although, again, this requires, I think, further investigation and undoubtedly will be a subject of further investigation as the impeachment inquiry goes on.
And a final question on this, is it fair to say, or is it reasonable for Americans to wonder if this is a sign of orienting foreign policy more in line with Russia? In other words, is it in Russia's interest for Ukraine not to have any assistance from us?
Well, as I might have said in my old days as a Soviet expert, it's objectively in Russia's interest for U.S. relations with Ukraine to be bad. It's objectively in Russia's interest for lethal military assistance to Ukraine not to, be delivered. But moreover, one of the more troubling things, and I think this came out yesterday in the discussion on the Sunday shows with Tom Bossert, my former colleague in the Bush administration and the former advisor for Homeland Security in the Trump administration, which is the president's willingness to countenance and it's recorded in the memorandum of conversation, some pretty crazy conspiracy theories about the server that was hacked by Russia at the Democratic National Committee. The president makes reference to CrowdStrike and to a conspiracy theory, which Tom Bossert said on television yesterday he repeatedly tried to debunk with the president because it has been debunked. And it's a conspiracy theory that suggests that somehow the Ukrainians were involved in the U.S. election in 2016 rather than the Russians. And that's something that comes right out of the Russian disinformation playbook.
Which is interesting because at that point you'd say that that story, then if it comes out of the Russian playbook, the propagation of that story would also be in the Russian interest.
Of course.
Okay, so let's move to the record of the call and how the records were stored, because I know this is an area you're intimately familiar with, and we've heard on the talk shows and various reporting on this that this was a call, perhaps one of many, according to the whistleblower complaint, that was stored on the highest level security server in the White House with very limited access, code level access. How unusual did you find that, or what was your assessment when you heard that? How did that strike you?
Well, the records of presidential conversations are usually very, closely held, and that's for a very good reason, which is that you want the confidentiality of presidential communications with foreign heads of state or heads of government, to be preserved, in their confidentiality, so that leaders will speak freely with the president, and the president can speak freely with them in the conduct of the nation's affairs. Having said that, they still get distribution inside the government to people who need to know what happened in these conversations, so that the normal business of government at other levels besides the presidential level can continue, and they can continue with an understanding of what the commander's intent, to use a military term, would be. In other words, what has the president agreed to in this conversation with foreign leader X, and how are we to implement that in order to make sure that the president's policy is being faithfully executed. In this instance, what appears to have happened, and this is based on both the whistleblower complaint memorandum, but also the testimony of the acting director of national intelligence, Joseph McGuire, last Thursday, it appears that these records, which are normally classified secret, in some cases, perhaps if there's some military discussion of nuclear weapons or something, they might be top secret, but would normally be stored in repositories that are not for compartmented intelligence. It appears that these were placed on a server that's usually reserved for code word intelligence, which is to say intelligence collected either through human means or national technical means of intelligence. That would mean there were either electronic intelligence, communications intelligence, electronic intelligence, or covert action. I mean, those are also code word documents. So it was held on an intelligence platform that you would normally not hold the records of these kinds of conversations on. I think that's actually important because some people have said that the whistleblower complaint had nothing to do with intelligence matters, and therefore it was not a valid use of the whistleblower law and the channel that it provides for flagging wrongdoing. But the abuse of a intelligence internal government communications network to hold code word documents does seem to me fall under that general rubric.
And so if we say there's a motivation that is maybe not the usual motivation for putting calls on here, people have speculated about what that motivation might be. And we've heard reports that other calls were stored on here, especially calls with the Saudis and with President Putin of Russia. Should that concern Americans in the sense that here you have a communication between the United States president and the president of Russia that's then put on a server where it's not normally kept? And I'm presuming, and maybe this isn't a fair assumption, but I'm thinking of President Putin's background, and I'm saying to myself, well, surely he has a recording of this exact same call. It strikes me as unlikely that he wouldn't have a recording of it, or is that just me getting too nutty?
No, I think the thing that we don't know is exactly what the motivation was for doing this. And there were a number of leaks early in the Trump administration, and I can imagine that people were concerned about further leaks of these conversations. And as a result of that, we're looking for some way to, further restrict distribution to make it less likely that you would have, a leak of one of these conversations. That's certainly possible. I think it shows extremely bad judgment if people use this particular um, mechanism for storage in order to prevent leaks. There's another more sinister interpretation, which is people are very, very concerned about what would happen if these conversations saw the light of day because of the fear that the president was engaged in wrongdoing, as you know, for instance, as the memcon of the Zelensky conversation seems to suggest. I mean, it seems to suggest a quid pro quo in everything other than a very direct way. So if that was the motivation, then that's more troubling, and it makes one wonder what else is in that repository, what other calls were put there, and for what reason. I mean, the Russians have actually come on the net, both presidential spokesman Peskov, but also I saw a statement today in which the Russians have said, you'll need our permission before you release, any transcripts or purported transcripts of our conversations. So that's just a reminder that that the Russians have their own version of this and undoubtedly will dispute whatever American version comes out.
Which is interesting, because if they have their own version of this and there's some motive for keeping it hidden from Americans or from the public, whether via leaks or some other method, I mean, should Americans be troubled by that? It feels like leverage. It feels like leverage.
It could mean they have some leverage over the president, and I think this is one of the reasons why, not only these memoranda of conversations, but also the revelations over the weekend about the content, further discussions of the president, the content of the president's conversations with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and then Ambassador Kislyak early in his administration are important, because in those conversations, apparently, according to the press reports, he told them that he really wasn't concerned about Russian election interference in 2016 and seemed to have suggested that the United States does this all the time, which is I think a form of moral equivalence, which I think is wrong, but moreover, it would appear to give the Russians a green light to continue to interfere in U.S. Elections. It was apparently concerns about that conversation that led a number of then White House officials to make phone calls to their colleagues around the government and try and collect copies of the notes of what happened in that meeting to make sure that they were quote unquote, locked down, as the whistleblower's complaint suggests about the memcons of the Zelensky conversation.
As someone with your background, we hear a lot about cyber warfare, and sometimes I think it's unclear exactly what that means. But is tampering with the U.S. elections a form of cyber warfare against the United States by Russia?
It is. I would broaden the aperture a little bit, Tom. I mean, we actually spoke to this at the Presidential Ideas Festival in a panel discussion we had down there at UVA on political warfare. And I think what we're really talking about is political warfare. We Americans tend to look at these things in sort of silos, and we see cyber warfare and information operations and various other activities as being in various different stovepipes. Agitation and propaganda, that's yet another one. The Russians see this as a suite of activities that are part of carrying out activities that allow them to essentially wage war against the United States without actually fighting or having kinetic military action go on. And the objective is to destabilize and demoralize our political system by spreading allegations and attacks on various people that they know will be repurposed in our own system for different parties' political benefit, but which have the overall impact of further dividing Americans, pouring gasoline on the political fires that already rage because of the extreme polarization that we suffer from as a society, and therefore making us less able or willing to push back against Russian activity in Europe and in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world. And they've been very effective at it, unlike in the Cold War when they were really rather bad at it. In the current environment, they've become quite good at it, and it's a real challenge that the United States faces now.
So if you look at this package together, what I'm kind of hearing is, first, in terms of our domestic policy, creating destabilization within our system. A lot of questions, a lot of ideas of illegitimacy. You know, certain things are just not seen as legitimate or seen as fake or rigged. And Americans are constantly asking that question. And then on the other side, you have a destabilization of our foreign policy with respect to, say, Europe and perhaps other actors. And so if you put those two kinds of destabilization together, you have a weaker position. The United States has a weaker position relative to Russia. Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary. And I think if you wanted to be fair to the Russian side of this, you would say, they think these activities, they're convinced these activities are defensive in nature because we are already trying to do this to their society. They look at the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004 and the so-called color revolutions that then followed in parts of Central Asia and the Caucasus, and then in the Arab Spring in the Middle East, as part of a general effort by the United States and the West to destabilize their regime and ultimately to overthrow Vladimir Putin. And so we, by and large, as far as I know, when we do broadcasting, when we do Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, we are committed to a standard of providing truthful information in societies where getting access to truthful information has not always been easy. And so there really is no moral equivalence here, because what they are doing is inventing things and injecting them into our system to try and take advantage of divisions that already exist. And they have been very, very effective at that.
I see. Well, listen, I could talk about this with you all day, and I probably should ask you at least one question about Turkey, because there are some things going on with Turkey, and you were ambassador to Turkey, and Turkey is, of course, across the Black Sea from Ukraine. And we know that there were some developments at the UN General Assembly with Turkey. They're important because of Syria and Kurds in Syria, and also sanctions on Iran. What can you tell us about the relationship with Turkey now?
Well, and also sanctions on Turkey, because Turkey purchased the S-400 missile system from Russia, which led the Department of Defense and Secretary Esper to suspend their participation in the F-35 combat aircraft program, fighter aircraft program, of which they have been a partner since pretty much the inception of the F-35 program, and run the risk of being subject to even more sanctions under the so-called CATSA Act, and that has created a real potential crisis in the relationship, particularly when you add it to the other issues that you have been discussing just now, with Syria, Iran, etc. So we are in a particularly serious crisis right now of relations with Turkey. It's not clear. There's no deadline in the legislation that imposes a time limit on the president to impose sanctions on Turkey. So that means the crisis is like a kind of slow-moving crisis. Mm-hmm. The president has asked Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, to go to Turkey, which he did, and Secretary Ross spent about a week there. And he's asked Senator Lindsey Graham to meet with the foreign ministers and defense ministers of Turkey, Ministers Çavuşoğlu and Hulusi Akar, to try and work out some kind of deal that would spare the president from having to impose sanctions or have the Congress force his hand, because I think he realizes that there's a lot of pressure building up in the Congress to sanction Turkey over this behavior. It's violation of the CATSA Act and making purchases from sanctioned Russian entities. It's not clear what that deal would be, but I think Senator Graham has made comments that suggest that what he has, and the president's made comments to Republican lawmakers that suggest he wants a free trade deal, which clearly is something that Secretary Ross has been working on. But he also understands he's got to get something on this S-400 problem if he wants to get out of the sanctions Congress intends to impose. So it looks like, from comments that Senator Graham has made, he has in mind something akin to what the U.S. government did 20 years ago when Greece bought S-300 missiles, or Cyprus, I'm sorry, Greek Cyprus bought S-300 missiles, the previous system, air defense system that Russia had been manufacturing at the time. They ended up on the island of Crete in their crates, undeployed. So Graham seems to be working on something like that would involve keeping the S-400s in crates and a sale of Patriots to Turkey in their stead in a free trade agreement, and somehow that package will spare us all from sanctions. I'm very skeptical that this is a doable project, but we'll see.
And you still have an autocrat that's the president either way, right?
President Erdogan remains the president, although he's very badly wounded by the results of the municipal elections this spring, and particularly the Istanbul mayoral election, which was, of course, where he made his political career as first mayor of Istanbul and then prime minister, now president. That city's been lost to the opposition, and all the opportunities for graft and corruption and skimming off the top that exists, unfortunately, in Turkish politics has passed out of his hands, as well as control of the largest city in Turkey. And he's clearly feeling the heat, even though he doesn't have to face the electorate again for another 4 or 5 years. He's clearly feeling the heat and trying to figure out how to get back political momentum inside of Turkey.
Well, listen, I really appreciate your time. You spent a lot of time with us today, and I do think it's super important that Americans look at this through the lens of foreign policy, through the lens of our national security, and I really, really appreciate your taking the time to do that with us today. Thanks, Eric.
Tom, it's always great to be with you.
All right, and thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time from right here at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia.